So anyway, again, welcome to Third Thursday for January 16th, 2025. Tonight, Carl Fowler brings us a program titled 200 Years of Beauty, Transportation and the Catskills, tracing the rise and fall of the 3-foot gauge Catskill Mountain Railroad, the affiliated Otis Elevating Railway, the standard gauge Ulster and Delaware Railroad, the Hudson River day and night lines, the West Shore Railroad, and the resorts they served, and more broadly, the development of transportation systems in the Catskills. Carl Fowler worked full-time selling passenger rail service for 34 years as general manager, vice president, and finally president of Rail Travel Center / Rail Travel Adventures. He was able to travel over 350,000 miles by train during his lifetime so far, I should point out, and can share perspectives both as a devoted train buff and as a rail travel professional. He's a 50-year member of the Rail Passenger Association, also known as NARP, and served as a vast vice chair of the RPA, as well as a long-term member of its council and board. So, Carl, it's a pleasure to welcome back to Mass Bay RRA.
Thank you. So this is, for those of you who are like me or rail fans, a program that doesn't seem to have a lot of trains in it for the first 10 minutes or so. And that's because this is really about a whole world. In the 19th century, one of the first destinations that could be called a destination for tourism, as opposed to people just needing to get somewhere, was the Catskill Mountain region of upstate New York. But it developed slowly, and over a 60-year period, access was almost entirely by steamboat and horse-drawn stagecoach or horse-drawn carriage. And then suddenly in the 1880s, an incredible transformation occurred with the coming of multiple railway lines and the movement of such great numbers of people to this region that, for example, in the peak ridership year of 1913, the Ulster and Delaware carried 676,000 riders in its season, which for tourism purposes was basically from the third week of June to the middle of September. So this is how that sort of special world grew. I want to make a note at the beginning of this that most of the black and white photos that we'll be looking at in this show come from the books about the Catskill Mountain and the Ulster and Delaware produced by a gentleman named John Ham, who lives in Hunter, New York, up in the Catskill Mountains, and who has very graciously allowed me to use the material from his books. So I want to give him a heads up. John is not as well known in the railfan book community as he ought to be, but he produces remarkable photojournalistic books, and they are something special. And in particular, he grew up along this line, actually rode the Hunter branch of the Ulster and Delaware, and shares with my father that love and affection for this long-forgotten line. But in a very real way, this is where what we now call multimodal tourism was invented. So with that, we look from the Hudson out to the Catskills, the Hudson Escarpment. So it began with picnics. In 1821-22, some travelers in the Catskill, New York area, looking west of the mountains, heard about this place called the Pine Orchard, from which there was a fantastic vista up and down the Hudson River, extending for over 60 miles and encompassing at its peak parts of 5 states. And they rode horseback, actually the first time, and walked up to it, had a good picnic. Gradually began the idea of developing overnight accommodation, first tents, then a sort of primitive platform situation. But by 1823, they began to build a real hotel. This is a spot that features in the novels of the then American giant, James Fenimore Cooper. Cooper has his intrepid scout, Natty Bumppo, standing here talking to a young guy about what he saw when he was young. This is me when I was young, at the age of 21, a long time ago. The little boy says to Natty, who was describing the view here at the Pine Orchard, "What'd you see, old man? What did you see?" And Natty responds, "All creation, lad, all creation." That sort of sums up the view. The hotel opened in 1823. It really began to grow after 1839 when the stagecoach company that was bringing the people up, the beach stagecoaches, also acquired ownership of the hotel and redesigned it to go from federal style to Greek revival, putting up 13 Corinthian columns commemorating the 13 original states on the platform that overlooked the Hudson River far below at the face of the Hudson. This is an amazing spot. Basically, the Catskill Mountain Escarpment jumps almost vertically from the Hudson River over 2,500 feet up to the peaks on the Front Range of the Catskills. And the views are incredible. The drill at the Catskill Mountain House was that you would stay and wake up at dawn to watch the sun rise up over the Berkshires far off to the east. And you'd write a letter to your friends saying, it's absolutely impossible to describe what I saw here, and then go on for 2 or 3 pages describing it. It also drew in artists before anybody else was much interested in landscape art. The first American school of art that was uniquely American, the Hudson River School, developed in large measure because of the ease of reaching these resorts. Now, the ease is in quotation marks. Again, you took a steamboat from New York to Catskill, and then there was a 5.5 to 7 hour stagecoach ride, depending upon road conditions, to get up to the pine orchard and to the Catskill Mountain House. But when you got there, the payoff was sufficient to justify the effort. This is a close-up view of the mountain house. Notice over here on the right, I don't know if you can see this, this is a searchlight. And we'll talk a bit more about that searchlight later, but one of the examples of the kinds of things we don't think would be all that exciting now was using a searchlight to pick out the steamboats on the Hudson River at night, 12 miles away to the east. So here's some literature promoting the Catskill Mountain region. And this is from after 1883. We know that because it's promoting the Catskill Mountain Railroad Corporation, which was a 3-foot narrow gauge line built specifically by the Catskill Mountain House to bring patrons up faster. But we'll get into that in much more detail later on here. Advertising for the 1880 season just before the railway arrived, at the foot of the mountains at least. High summer was $21 a week. Spring and fall dropping down to $17.50 in the early part of the summer, and later on in the year, to the closure at the beginning of August, down to $14 a week. This included all meals, did not include transportation from Catskill to the hotel. That was an additional $2. Love the description here. The house is built on a projecting ledge, 2,700 feet above tidewater, and commands a view unsurpassed in beauty and extent by any other in the world. 10,000 square miles of the valley of the Hudson, with 60 miles of the river directly in front and in full view, stretch out beneath the beholder, from the base of the mountains to the Adirondacks to the north, to the Greens and the Berkshire Hills to the east. The atmosphere is delightful, invigorating, and pure. The great elevation and surrounding forests rendering it absolutely free from malaria. It affords relief to sufferers from chills and fever and asthma, hay fever, loss of appetite, and general debility. The temperature is always 15 to 20 degrees lower than in Catskill Village or New York City. Western Union Telegram Office in the hotel. And from there, you could resist only at your own will. Now, the hotel's been gone since 1963 as an extant building, and since 1941 as an operating building. But there are things left that still evoke the era. This is the cliff that the hotel was perched upon. This is the example of one of the stagecoaches that would have brought you up, with luggage stacked on top and also sometimes in a trailing trailer. Charles A. Beach, again, ran the stagecoaching service, and he ran the transportation system to the mountain house until 1918, so it really lasted a long time. Early picture of one of the stages running along the shores of North Lake just very shortly before arriving at the hotel. If you look carefully, there's actually evidence of the railroad here. Here's the tracks of the 3-foot narrow gauge line running into Tannersville and Haynes Falls, and again, we'll talk more about that later on. In 1880, George Harding of Philadelphia, a patent attorney who, among other things, had defended the Samuel F.B. Morse in the law argument about the telegraph system, was a guest at the Catskill Mountain House, and his daughter had been told not to eat anything with red meat. Sounds very contemporary. But on one day, he couldn't get her a fried chicken dinner from the Mountain House. He was terribly upset about this. He called Mr. Beach over to argue when the maitre d' wouldn't back down on giving his daughter a fried chicken dinner. The menu tonight is prime rib of beef, and that's what we've got. And if you don't like it, you should set your own hotel up. You need to be careful who you insult, because Mr. Harding had the money to do precisely that. In the winter of 1880, he began construction on what would ultimately cost him $1,500,000, what became the, at least by claim, the largest wood frame building in the world, the largest hotel in the world. And it was big. As it first opened, it had 600 rooms, but almost immediately the capacity was doubled, purportedly to 1,200 rooms. now, or was it 1,000 rooms, or was it 600 rooms accommodating 1,200 people? You get different versions of the legend, but it was a huge hotel. Of that, there is no argument. And it sat directly on top of South Mountain, looking down on the Catskill Mountain House. The mountain house had somehow managed to avoid buying the land directly above it. They, for years, had trails laid out that went over these knolls and beautiful viewpoints, but they had neglected to actually acquire clear ownership, and Harding did. And what a hotel. Here's the dining room. Dining room was 400 feet long and supposedly could seat 600 people at one seating. The area of the dining room is in the picture at the top, the area to the left. Each table had a waiter and busboy assigned just to that table. Hotel operated from 1881 to 1924. Purportedly never made any money, although I actually question that. It was generally full. It burned to the ground on September 8th, or was it the 11th? You get different names in different sources, of 1924, just after the end of the season, while they were boiling lard for soap in the kitchen. It got very hot. The cook stepped out for a moment. The lard boiled over, and the largest wood frame building hotel in the world burned to the ground overnight, leaving the mess you see at the top when the fires were put out. But oh, what a place it had been. And again, think about the size and grandeur of this hotel. It had its own symphony orchestra. It had the first long-distance switchboard in a hotel or a resort area in the United States. It had ballrooms. It had its own private stagecoach road from Palinville at the foot of the mountains directly to the hotel, built at huge expense and actually only really needed for a little over a year and a half, because then the railroads arrived. It was quite a place. But it was drawn because, of course, of this stupendous scenery. The Hudson Escarpment, rising up the 2,700 feet directly from the Hudson River, is incised by glacially carved canyons, and the most remarkable probably is the Catskill Clove. Catskill is the Dutch word for Wildcat River Mountains, and that's the source of the name of the Catskills. This clove has 4 magnificent waterfalls in it. We'll show you some of those in just a moment here. If the Catskill still stood, it would have been directly on top of the rounded mountain before us, which is South Mountain. Here's the Thomas Cole of the Catskill Falls. This is the highest waterfall in the state of New York, between the two levels of it, 286 feet in drop, and it is quite a falls. Pictures I took of it in 2012, just after a really heavy rainstorm when it was really flowing. In the hotel era, there was a third grand hotel right at the lip of the falls called the Laurel House. And the Laurel House had a cute system going to make sure that the falls always looked good. They built a dam on the Catskill Creek, also known there as Lake Creek, just about 100 yards up from the cliff. And they would impound the water for 2 or 3 hours. And then if you paid a quarter, enough people did it, they'd open the gates and turn on the waterfall again. This is a new platform the state has just reconstructed that was once a famous spot in the days of Laurel House. And if you look carefully in the lower portion of the picture here, you can see a sort of a pathway. This is an overhanging cavern that you can walk into and actually have the falls come down in front of you. Legendary spot from the 19th century. At the top, there's a carved memorial to a dog carved into the cliffs. Supposedly, according to the story, the dog was convinced to jump off the cliff when his master pointed at something down the canyon. Oh, oops, alas. It's another picture of the falls on that busy day. And we can't have a talk about the Catskills without a cat. This gentleman's about to walk down the new 240 stairs the state of New York has just put in from the top of the falls to the bottom with his world's most well-behaved kitten on his shoulder. That cat didn't budge all the way down, and it would have been gone forever if it had jumped off. I couldn't resist that. About a half a mile down from the Catskill Falls is the Bastion Falls. If you ever drive up New York Highway 23A, you go directly by this on the famous Horseshoe Curve. This one only drops about 170 feet in total, and the main drop itself only about 70, but there's multiple levels of it. About 3 miles away, further upstream at the head of the canyon, is the Haynes Falls. This one's at least 180 feet high. If you count the 5 cascades that are below it, about 270. This was also the site of very famous Hudson River School paintings. And finally, the Santa Cruz Falls, which often almost but not quite dries up, but has this remarkable multiple layers and multicolor of rocks. Vistas of the mountains from South Mountain. Both hotels developed extensive carriage tours, horse-drawn carriage tours, and extensive walking paths, almost all of which went out and back in loops to make it easy and to avoid the need to repeat anything. And these are the kind of views you got. This is from Sunset Rock, which was famous both to Catskill Mountain House and Catskill Hotel guests. Across the canyon is Twilight Park, private cottage colony where my family had a cottage. You actually see it here, but too far away to get much detail, but that was our home for 90 years. The 7 Days newspaper here in Vermont carries Harry Bliss's cartoons, and Harry obviously at least once went to Sunset Rock. See the scene. How will we ever turn our backs on all of this? Two lakes now. Originally they were separated. In recent years, the state of New York has raised the level of South Lake and made one larger lake out of them. The Catskill Mountain House would have been right here on the left-hand side of the picture, and the Catskill here on top of South Mountain. All the land in front of you was either the property of the Catskill Mountain House or the Hotel Catskill to the ridge here. But this is actually the Catskill Clove, that stupendous canyon that I've been showing slides of. Amazing spot. And here's the little Laurel House, 1847 Laurel House, completed by the falls. You can see this sort of looks like the switch tender's house. That's the place that opened and closed the gates to allow the falls to flow at peak. This one lasted the longest. It still was in business in the 1960s. Catskill again burned in 24. Catskill Mountain House closed for World War II in 1941 and never managed to reopen. And the Laurel House operated until about 1968. So it lasted long enough to get to the overstuffed furniture era. But finally, the trains arrive. By 1882, two railroads had reached at least the foot of the Catskills. The Catskill Mountain House itself was building a 3-foot narrow gauge network, which initially took you to the foot of the mountains. You still had about a 2-hour carriage road up to the hotel from there. Although by 1893, they would open up a remarkable incline railway to close that gap. The standard gauge Ulster and Delaware Railroad, coming directly from the steamboat landing in Kingston, also built a route into the mountains. So we'll try to trace these for you. This is the Catskill Mountain Line, which went to Palinville, where you could connect to the new turnpike up to the mountaintop. Later, the Otis Elevating Railway filled in the gap. The Ulster and Delaware standard gauge to Phoenicia, and then they built a narrow gauge branch line again up to Hunter and to the Catskill Hotel station, which was about 2 miles from the hotel. And working with the Catskill Mountain House, the Catskill Mountain House had the right to run its narrow gauge trains as far as Tannersville on the new line. But pretty quickly, it became clear that standard gauge was the way to go, and the Ulster and Delaware converted its branch line up to the mountaintop to standard gauge by 1900. The main line eventually would reach Oneonta. It had theoretical dreams as a freight carrier as well as a passenger carrier, and one of them was to supplant the Delaware and Hudson Canal by taking anthracite coal off the Delaware and Hudson at Oneonta and taking it down by train to Kingston, where it would then go down on barges to New York. That never really paid off very much for the Ulster and Delaware, but passengers sure as hell did. The most profitable year for passenger service was 1921, but the peak ridership year again was 1913 with those 676,000 riders. So you got to the mountains by steamboat until the opening at least of the West Shore Railroad in 1883. And the great steamboats of the Hudson River Day Line would, for more than a century, be a remarkable conveyor belt to take people up to the Catskill Mountains. You could board the Ulster and Delaware at the pier in Kingston, and you could board the Catskill Mountain Railroad at the pier in Catskill. So in both cases, the transition was seamless. These vessels were licensed to carry as many as 4,000 passengers. The Alexander Hamilton in the top view here and the bottom view was the longest lived at the end, at least. It survived to 1972. For many years, the Hudson River Day Line preferred not to run on Sunday, and if it did, only operated what were sort of sightseeing cruises on Sunday. But the main show in this schedule from 1921 is the daily, including Sunday by then, because they had finally decided they would have to run on Sundays, from New York up to Albany. And you can see that that took all day. but it way stopped along the river. And this is not dissimilar to what you find to this day, even in Switzerland and Europe. Many years later, this is near the end, when they were turning back at Poughkeepsie every day after 1948. Largest vessel in the line was the Washington Irving, licensed again to carry 4,000 passengers. She was also the only Hudson River Day Line vessel to ever be involved in a serious accident and have a passenger killed. She struck a barge while backing out of her pier in New York City and sunk into the mud, but a couple of passengers and crew members panicked and jumped and drowned. Broke the heart of Mr. Alcott, the owner of the line. These are some interiors of the magnificent grand 4,000 passenger steamer. Notice the writing rooms have Moorish design, the left, the dining room in the center, and the art gallery, original artworks commemorating the scenes of upstate New York on the right. The day line was not the only way to go up the river. You could also go by night. Magnificent multi-hundred passenger steamboats with cabins. See the Fort Orange, and here's a map of the Hudson River Nightline suggesting you could ride the Nightline to Albany and then go on to Montreal and Canada. Both the day line and the night line actually accepted New York Central tickets and vice versa between New York and Albany, so you had the choice of going one way by train and one way by steamer. Here's a deck plan for the Fort Orange. Hundreds of cabins. In theory, you could also sit up all night, but virtually no one did. Now, even to this day, there are still occasionally overnight boat services on the Hudson River run by American Cruise Lines. An example of it there. And these pictures were taken from the railroad that began to supplant the dominance of the day line, the West Shore Line, which went by 1883 at least as far as Kingston and eventually all the way to Buffalo in competition with the New York Central on the far side of the river. But it was possible to take the New York Central, for example, to Rhinecliff and then take the ferry over to Kingston and board the Ulster and Delaware. And similarly, you could take a ferry across to Catskill from the river line of the New York Central. This vessel, the Rip Van Winkle, still does day cruises out of Kingston down to Poughkeepsie. Magnificent stretch of the river. It's the boathouse for the J.P. Morgan estate. This is the basin of the Roundout Creek in Kingston, New York, and this is where many of the Hudson River steamers were built and where many of them spent their winters. And the tug in the foreground, the Lehigh Valley Tug, it's a true steam-powered tug, one of the last steam-powered vessel regularly on the Hudson. This is the same basin from above, taken from the high trestle that the West Shore Railroad goes over just before arriving in Kingston, where it crossed the Ulster and Delaware at Diamond, and where Kingston Union Station was also the headquarters of the UND. This basin below, talking again about anthracite coal, was also the end of the Delaware and Hudson Canal. Oldest American transportation company is the Delaware and Hudson Corporation, which began in 1823 as a canal operator and eventually grew into a railroad and steamboats on Lake George and Lake Champlain. 1892, the Catskill Mountain Railroad was complete to Palinville and then up the mountains, straight up the mountains, with a funicular railway that took you directly up to a point only about 200 yards from the hotel. And this is the setup at the bottom. But notice rather uniquely for a funicular railway that there are actually freight cars in the cable car station, incline station. This line could take not only passengers, but also carloads of coal and baggage up the mountainside. It was about 1,700 feet long, pardon me, gained about 1,700 feet, excuse me, a little over a mile long, pardon me. Took first a narrow gauge train from Catskill to the foot of the mountains. Then you changed to the incline to ascend up to the Catskill Mountain House. And at the end, you had one last short, about 7-minute long stagecoach ride up to the hotel. A couple of postcards from about 1900. Catskill Mountain saw itself as an integrated transportation system. Once you got to the top of the mountain on the incline, you initially could ride on the Catskill Railway that was being developed by the Ulster and Delaware. But after 1900, when it was standard gauged, the Mountain House realized if they wanted to keep business going into the interior of the mountain region, they needed to build their own line in competition. So they built the Catskill and Tannersville, which was commonly called the Huckleberry Railroad, the classic slow railroad joke being that the train was so slow that you get off the first car, pick a quart of huckleberries, and get back on the last car before the train went by. And typically the train was only 1 or 2 cars long. Here's an example of the integrated timetable from 1916, excuse me, for the steamers, both day and night. The New York Central on the east shore of the Hudson and the West Shore Railroad on the west shore, the Catskill Mountain Railroad narrow gauge line to the foot of the mountains, and then the inclined plane to Otis Summit, and then the Catskill and Tannersville line over to Tannersville. This operated pretty successfully for quite a few years. 40,000 passengers the first year came on this line, and another 40,000 on the competing Ulster and Delaware line. But neither the UND nor the Catskill Mountain foresaw the impact of the automobile, nor of changing tastes in tourism. World War I disrupted ridership. The Catskill Mountain shut its inclined plane and narrow gauge system in 1918. The equipment was sold off. Interestingly enough, the operating cars, the coaches from the incline, went to Chattanooga, Tennessee, to the Lookout Mountain incline. A couple of the coaches used by the Ulster and Delaware's narrow gauge division went to the White Pass in Yukon and are still there to this day. And at least one Catskill Mountain Railroad coach of the group used between Catskill and the foot of the mountain went to the Huckleberry Railroad, remember that name, in Flint, Michigan, where they operate to this day behind, among other things, a former Rio Grande K-27-282 Mikado from the narrow gauge system in Colorado. The incline was built to last for the ages. I took this picture at 95 miles an hour on the Ethan Allen Express a year or two ago, and if you look across the river, you can see this straight slash mark on the side of the Catskill Mountains. That's the cut of the Otis Elevating Railway. It's still there to this day. Power line goes up it now, but it'll be there for eternity. The Huckleberry Railroad I mentioned, this is not a picture of the early narrow gauge line. This is a short tourist railway that my father was talked into investing in to support a little tourist attraction called Rip's Retreat, which supposedly recreated the village that Rip Van Winkle went up to the mountains from for his great 20-year sleep. I'm not sure if that's Dad looking out of the cab or not, but he sunk $15,000 into this. Only ran for about 2.5 to 3 years. Eventually he got 5,000 out. The train went down to the foot of the mountains and ran at a Western cowboy-oriented tourist attraction called Carson City for about 25 more years. And I have no idea where it has gone now, but it is neither on top of the mountain nor at the bottom. My dad was a nice guy and a great rail fan, but he was not a good businessman. On the left is the puppet theater that was used for Rip's Retreat to do the play on Rip Van Winkle. Here again is another map of the Ulster and Delaware system. This time we're not going to look at the Catskill Mountain with it. And this is from the peak of the UND when, after 1904, roughly, it managed to finally get all the way to Oneonta. UND continued to operate passenger trains to the mountaintop till 1939, but the bottom was knocked out by the fire that destroyed the Catskill Hotel. You get rid of a hotel that has 1,000 rooms and you lose a lot of ridership on your line. And then came paved highways, and then came bus services competing from both Trailways and Greyhound. And after 1939, it was briefly, very briefly, freed only until February of 1940. And then the branch line from Phoenicia up to the mountaintop was lifted. Ulster and Delaware, though, was a major show. There were through parlor cars and sleepers from as far away as Washington, D.C. and Philadelphia. This about roughly 1896 timetable. There is a Sunday-only sleeper from Weehawken to Bloomville up in the Catskills. Various drawing room cars. There's a drawing room with buffet on one of the trains, number 27, Weehawken to Bloomville. And here's the operating schedule for that period. This is only for the standard gauge on this particular page, but by the time this came out, the narrow gauge line up to the mountaintop was also operating. Train 1 at 4:40 in the morning only goes as far as Fleischmann's, but you can see there's substantially more trains later in the day. It was the practice of the UND to operate second sections if needed. You can see Kingston Union Station on the left. The crack train of the line was the Rip Van Winkle Flyer, at its peak all parlor car. From a bit later, after the branch has been standard gauge, this looks like a lot fewer trains, but these would have run again in multiple sections. And this is also a May timetable. So this is the beginning of the summer season, but not its peak. They're up to 4 trains a day. At peak, they would have been up to 10 or 11. These are shots from the branch that went up to the Grand Hotels. The top picture is near Edgewood Station. The bottom one on the first summit on the line, which was at Stony Clove Notch. Stony Clove Notch, elevation above sea level, a little over 2,000 feet, 2,060. Long sustained 3% grade to get up to this. Then it was much faster heading on down the line at either side. These are, again, pictures from the standard gauge era. The double header is pulling a 10-car long train. That's a big one for this line. This is what it looks like today. New York Highway 214 is not actually on the railroad grade, but it's almost on it. The highway was there when the road was there as well, although obviously it wasn't a modern paved highway. The Stony Clove Notch is a remarkable glacial carved cleft in the mountains, and this is where the railway actually cleaved the range. And here's a schedule really that is from the peak period on the branch. Notice the Rip Van Winkle flyer coming out of Phoenicia at 4:32 in the afternoon. Waiting for the train at Tannersville, New York, 1901. Good ridership day. Haynes Falls Station, this is where my family lived. The day the railway closed, the stations were intact. By next spring, they were still intact, and my father and his best friend, John McGann, decided that if they wanted to preserve anything of the railway, they might collect the depot signs that hung on the eaves of the station. You can see one here for Haynes Falls. They grabbed the Haynes Falls, Tannersville, and Catskill station signs and stashed them under John McGann's cottage. Dad and John had had one other interaction with this history program for you before that. At the age of 5, they had both watched the Catskill Hotel burn to the ground across the valley from their cottage in Twilight Park. But this is the last station to be built on the Ulster and Delaware, the new Haynes Falls station, and it still stands to this day and has just been gorgeously renovated. A little bit of track was reinstalled in front. The bricks were actually part of the platform. Bluestone, really, it's not really bricks. Trains at Haynes Falls when it was still operating. Now, this is a wonderful picture showing Laurel House Station. And I bring this up for 2 reasons. One, because it really shows the relationship of the railroad to the hotels, but the other because it's actually also a fake. We think now that AI and computer editing makes it possible to create scenes that never quite existed. I spent about 3 visits to the new rail trail that runs on the UND grade, trying to find where this picture could have been. The forest has grown back, and it's all deeply forested now. But the drop off into the clove for the waterfall is about 150 yards off to the side of the track, not right next to it. And in fact, this was created as an advertising shot to convince you that you should take the Ulster and Delaware to see the Catskill Falls. This is what it looks like now along the grade. This one, however, is not a fake. The Laurel House Hotel was served by both the narrow gauge line on the left and the standard gauge line on the right. And the trains did typically run at about the same time because they were trying to connect to the same steamboats down in the Hudson. Laurel House initially had a small station. Later it got a proper building, and this was the Laurel House Station sign. And this was taken in my garage 2 years ago, just before I donated it to the Haynes Falls Historical Society, which now has the Haynes Falls Station. So what happened to the real Haynes Falls sign and the Tannersville sign and the Catskill sign that my dad and John had selectively confiscated in the summer of 1940? The answer is we had them with us until the 1960s. They went to Florida when my dad retired to Florida. And Mom and Dad decided that the perfect place for them to be enjoyed by other people would be at a Victoria Station restaurant in Winter Park, Florida, where we lived. They got a signed agreement that if the restaurant was ever to close or wanted to change the decor, that they would return the signs. But of course, Mom and Dad moved much further away in Florida. The hotel, the restaurant chain went broke and the signs vanished. But this one turned up in an antique shop in Tannersville about 15 years ago, and I bought it with the intent always of donating it back to the Historical Society. It now lives in the Haynes Falls Station, which is about a mile from where it originally hung. Originally, it hung on the lower of the two stations photographed here. First, there was a sort of Adirondack lodge for the Laurel House Hotel, and you bought tickets in the hotel. Later, however, the Ulster and Delaware built this nice, tidy little depot at the Laurel House. And I used to play in this as a little boy. I remember this vividly. That could be me in the agent's trail there, although, of course, obviously it's before the abandonment of the railroad. But this stood till the burning down deliberately by the state of New York of the Laurel House Hotel in the 1960s. End of the line was Catskill Station. You had again to get on a stagecoach almost to the end of service to get up to either of the hotels, but it was a short ride. To the Mountain House was about a mile. To the Catskill Hotel, it was about 2.5 miles. And here's the stagecoaches meeting the train at the end of the line. Sadly, the Union Station here for both the narrow gauge and standard gauge lines burned to the ground sometime during or after the Second World War. There is no trace to speak of it anymore, except a water tower still is in place up on the hill for the small engine terminal here. So what happened to the Catskill Mountain House itself? As I mentioned, it did close in 1941 because of the Second World War. It by then was catering to a Jewish clientele and was owned by a man named Milo Claude Mosman, who desperately wanted to keep it open. When the war ended, he planned to reopen, but he needed to do some renovations. Before he could complete the renovations, a hurricane came up the Hudson River and damaged the facade of the hotel, knocking down a number of the Corinthian columns. And then it was a desperate race to see if he could raise enough money to restore the ruin or if the ruin would overtake him. In the 1960s, he gradually tore down the two wings. The low building on the right here is actually the stables. The east wing of the hotel is gone by this time. The other wing is still sort of there, although you can see the guts of the hotel inside. There's a wonderful book about the Catskill Mountain House called The Catskill Mountain House by Roland Van Zandt, which I strongly recommend. And he talks about breaking into the ruins and going into the ballroom and finding a grand piano upside down. And I can tell you that I also broke into the ruins and went into the ballroom, and I saw the grand piano upside down, so I know I wasn't bullshitting. That's myself on the left and my mom. This was probably taken about 1960 by my dad. The state finally acquired the ruins. Mosman could not raise the money to restore it. He was going to fix up just the center section where the columns were of the original 1823 building. But instead, he ended up selling it to the state of New York for an expansion of the New York State Forest Preserve. And the Forest Preserve law in New York says that lands incorporated into the state forest shall be kept forever wild, which at that time at least, NCON was interpreting to mean that if they bought it, they had to burn it down. So they bought the Mountain House and they burned it to the ground in January of 1963. It was announced on all the radio and television stations this was going to happen, but there were phone calls desperately saying a volcano was erupting on top of the Catskills, but it was the Mountain House bidding farewell. However, tourism is far from dead in the Catskill Mountains. Probably 15 times the people who came in the 19th century come today by car. And even before the Grand Hotel era peaked, private cottage communities were beginning to be developed on the mountaintop. We again owned a cottage in Twilight Park, and this is the entrance to Twilight Park, which goes directly over the crest of Haynes Falls. I showed that to you earlier. Here's the crest of it. There's, by the way, a Thomas Cole painting that looks exactly like these photos. Here's Santa Cruz Falls with a gazebo in front of it. That was the one I mentioned also that has the red shelving in it at one point on the falls drop. Twilight Park, as originally built, had 4 large hotels in it, but nothing like the Catskill Mountain House. These had 70 or 80 rooms. The last one to survive was Legend Inn, and this is one of its brochures from the 1950s. They were by then charging a max of $110 a week with 3 meals, and as little as $63. In fact, one room for $56 for the whole week. This is the view from the porch of my cottage. My family's cottage. We don't own it anymore. That was the Fowler family cottage. Across the street was one of the few garages on the mountaintop, but upstairs in what was supposed to have been servants' quarters, my dad built another model railroad. This was the Catskill Mountain Railroad of Germany in the Catskills. Dad bought Markland HO for us, and he snuck this railroad up on me. I had no idea he was building it. He did it very quietly in the early spring one year. And when we came back for the summer in 1960, here it was. It's a gorgeous area up there. This is another of the parks nearby. This is Onteora Park, which was primarily the Broadway theater crowd when it first opened. A bit further west, other Grand hotels. On the left, the Grand Hotel, which belonged to the Ulster and Delaware itself. On the right, Churchill Hall in Stamford, New York. Part of that actually still stands as offices for the local Voc Tech School. Passenger service of the UND main line ended in 1954, and since 1930 to actually 32 for full acquisition of part of the New York Central system, later Penn Central, finally Conrail. But parts of it still operate for tourist trains. This is me, my wife, and my daughter Penny standing on the platform at Arkville, about to ride the Red Heifer. Here's Stanford Station. This was one of the early terminus points of the line, now being converted into a trail in that area. So is it all gone? No. There is one remarkable, amazing last stand of the Grand Hotel era still in the Catskill region, and this is the Mohonk Mountain House. Not Mohawk, but Mohonk, M-O-H-O-N-K. Place started by two Quaker school teachers who went up to have a picnic again. They love these picnics on a place called Paltz Point, overlooking New Paltz, New York, where there was a view that encompassed 6 states. And there was a tavern down at the bottom. Now, as good Quakers, they did not have much use for a tavern, but they bought it to put up their friends on what they had purchased as a place to build a summer cottage, and quickly discovered that there was money to be made by taking in guests, and they needed money anyway to complete the place. And what they ultimately completed was an amazing 300-plus room Grand Hotel, a pastiche of mostly sort of Swiss architecture, but also stone and brick and clapboard, and an amazing setting. The Shawangunk Mountains technically are a different range than the Catskills, but most people think of them as sort of the front range of the Catskills. This is from Paltz Point, today known as Skytop, looking out over the hotel towards the Catskills, about 9 miles distance. This little pond is actually a fire prevention reservoir. My wife and I in a little gazebo. The gazebos are the symbol of Mohonk. There were 85 of these in the property at one time, and as you hike in the woods on the circular trails and circular carriage roads that go out and back to the hotel, you encounter these at either places to rest or more commonly at beautiful viewpoints. There's Skytop Tower, stone tower built as a memorial to one of the Smileys who originally built the place. You can see up there, see if I can count all the states: New Jersey, Pennsylvania, New York, Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Vermont. 6 states. Formal gardens, which turn over 3 times a year, almost all annual plantings outside. The whole Catskill Mountain House, Catskill Hotel milieu survives here. All meals are included, almost all activities are included. There are concerts and talks. There are guided walks, carriage roads. They still offer carriage rides. Easy trails, harder trails, but again, the most common detail is that almost everything runs as a circle out and back from the hotel. And here's the view out to the Catskills. Washington Irving's Rip Van Winkle opens with a description of the glory of the Catskill Mountain House. And it continues near the end of the first paragraph. Sometimes late in the evening, when the rest of the sky is cloudless, they will gather a hood of gray vapors about their summits, which in the last rays of the setting sun will glow and light up like a crown of glory. And with that, that's the 200 Years of Beauty slide program. I hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you, Carl.
Gladly take questions. I appreciate the note someone put up about when Mr. Mosman died. I didn't know that. I actually knew the man as a boy, but I knew him, 1958. Whoever did that, thank you very much. That's a piece of information in my home that I can add to my arsenal of useless trivia.
Here's a question lurking here that I actually thought of myself. Was the funicular railway a cog railway?
No, it was an incline plane, which means a funicular. The up car balanced the descending car. And there were gigantic stationary steam locomotives up at the summit, which powered it. You had to change trains down in the valley, but they could switch the coal cars so that they were able to go between the 2 lines. The Ulster and Delaware had a transfer table at Phoenicia before they standard gauge their branch, so that the narrow gauge cars could be put onto standard gauge trucks or vice versa at Phoenicia, but they only used that for about 5 years and then simply converted that line to standard gauge.
Okay, we do have a question. Did the New York, Ontario, and Western run through the Catskills?
Yes, if you count the Shangham Valley as Catskills, Mohawk was served by three railway stations. The closest was on the Walk-Hill Valley Railway down at New Paltz, directly at the foot of the hill. But almost as close was the New York, Ontario, and Western station at High Falls. Both of those are gone, of course, completely gone. But the third possibility, which the Mountain House will still send a limo to pick you up today if you want, was the New York Central Station to Poughkeepsie, which an airline's about 10 miles away. And I have gone to the Mountain House by train to Poughkeepsie and been picked up. So it can still be done. No stage now, but a limo or a taxi will come if prearranged.
Mm-hmm. Great. Okay. Well, thank you again, Carl. Some very interesting pictures. I'm already thinking, boy, I've never really visited the Catskills. So hopefully that your show has inspired a bunch of people to visit the Catskills, and we'll move on to the informal section.
You can get to the top of the Catskill Falls on a path that literally will take a wheelchair. The Catskill Mountain House site is part of the North Lake State Campsite and can be walked to on a very easy carriage road to get to the view at the Catskill Mountain House site. The Cottageville Hotel is harder to find because the forest is completely grown up over the site. But what's called the Escarpment Trail still leads out to some of its famous landmarks like Boulder Rock. The town of Haines Falls is the nearest town to these sites. But the Bastion Falls, as I mentioned, actually goes right by you on the way up New York 23A, which in 4 miles climbs 2,000 feet from Palinville up to Haines Falls. And it's a very compact area, actually, where most of this grandeur is. But it's lost none of its punch and was as famous as Niagara Falls or the Grand Canyon in the 19th century. Indeed, the essential tour of the United States was supposed to include visiting Niagara Falls, Lake George, and the Catskill Mountain House.
Okay, one last question has popped up here. Is there any desire to develop new Catskill properties, or are they now considered passe because so many other resorts are reachable by airplane?
There had been a period of almost probably 40 or 50 years when no consequential new hotels opened up in the Catskills, but that has now changed. A combination of skiing at Hunter, one of the largest ski areas in the United States, and down at Bel Air Mountain along the Ulster and Delaware Main Line, and just the need for more hotel accommodation. But again, the state lands, which probably is 65–70% of the Catskill region, are explicitly prohibited from development beyond campgrounds or the most basic facilities to support them. That said, there are new hotels now in the Catskills, and very comfortable ones. Most of the grand hotels are gone, Mohawk being an exception, but a few of the boarding houses have hung on. And there are some smaller hotels like the Mountain Brook in Tannersville, which basically it's sort of like an Adirondack Lodge moved to the Catskills and is very luxurious, but not crazy expensive. But no, there's no more Twilight Parks going to happen, cottage colonies like that, because you simply can't put that much housing up now and with controls. But individual private housing is certainly being built, and new hotels starting in the 1960s kind of began to gradually return.
Okay, so once again, Carl, thank you very much for a very entertaining program.